The Battle of Endor is often framed as a climactic military defeat, yet its deeper meaning rests in how deliberately the Empire mistook spectacle for strategy. Palpatine did not design a flexible campaign meant to adapt to resistance. He designed a theatrical snare meant to demonstrate inevitability. Every visible move was intended to teach the rebels a lesson about futility rather than to defeat them through layered planning. Endor was a performance staged for witnesses rather than a war fought against uncertainty. The Emperor believed that if inevitability could be displayed clearly enough, resistance itself would psychologically collapse. From the moment the second Death Star was revealed, the Empire's posture shifted from calculated dominance to ceremonial arrogance. The station was incomplete by choice, a lure meant to entice rather than a risk meant to be mitigated. Palpatine believed the rebels would behave predictably, strike directly, and die publicly. This assumption shaped every Imperial decision that followed, turning planning into pageantry. What appeared to be confidence was, in truth, a refusal to imagine deviation. Arrogance manifested most clearly in how narrow the Empire's margin for error truly was. One shield generator protected the most valuable military asset ever constructed. One ground installation anchored the entire deception. One operational assumption held that no indigenous force could meaningfully interfere. Redundancy was abandoned because the Emperor did not believe it was necessary. To prepare alternatives would have implied doubt, and doubt had no place in Palpatine's worldview. Imperial doctrine had long favoured overwhelming displays of force, yet Endor revealed how hollow that doctrine became when divorced from adaptability. The Empire expected a conventional engagement between fleets, capital ships exchanging fire in predictable formations. Instead, the rebels treated space as a delaying action rather than a decisive battlefield. Their objective was not to destroy the fleet, but to survive long enough for conditions to change. This asymmetry of purpose undermined the Empire before the first shot was fired. Irregular warfare had never been the Empire's strength, and Endor exposed this limitation brutally. The rebels fought like survivors who expected loss and planned around it. They improvised, fragmented, and leveraged chaos rather than suppressing it. The Empire fought like an institution that assumed obedience and clarity. When chaos emerged, it had no doctrine to absorb it. Nowhere was this more evident than on the forest moon itself. The ground assault was designed as a formality, not a contested operation. Imperial forces treated the terrain as irrelevant and the local population as incapable. The Ewoks were not accounted for because accounting for them would have meant acknowledging uncertainty. That single blind spot unravelled the shield operation with devastating speed. Centralized. Command was the Empire's greatest strength and its most fatal weakness. Every decision flowed upward toward Palpatine and Vader. Autonomy was discouraged because obedience was prized above initiative. This structure functioned efficiently only while control remained absolute. The moment control wavered, the system had nothing beneath it to compensate. Palpatine's presence aboard the Death Star was meant to be the final seal of inevitability. He believed his personal observation would guarantee perfection. In reality, it concentrated failure into a single point. By placing himself at the centre, he ensured that any disruption would cascade instantly. The Empire had no mechanism to continue without him directing its will. Fear had once been the Empire's most effective instrument, yet by Endor, its edge had dulled. The destruction of the first Death Star introduced a dangerous idea into the galaxy. That idea was not hope, but proof. Proof that Imperial icons could die. The second Death Star was meant to erase that proof by overwhelming it with scale. Bigger, more powerful, more complete in its symbolism. Yet scale does not restore fear, once vulnerability is understood. Fear relies on perceived permanence, not temporary intimidation. Endor reintroduced doubt at the exact moment the Empire tried to erase it. Within the throne room, Palpatine treated the battle as already resolved. He spoke not as a commander reacting to events, but as an oracle describing a finished future. Luke was not presented with choices, but with conclusions. This rhetorical certainty reflected how the Emperor viewed the war itself. Outcomes were assumed, not earned. That assumption bled outward into every Imperial layer. Officers executed orders without understanding purpose. Fleets held formation, even as conditions worsened. No one was empowered to reinterpret the situation dynamically. The system rewarded obedience even when obedience accelerated collapse. Vader's role was similarly constrained by this rigidity. He was a weapon, not a strategist. His presence was meant to enforce inevitability, not adapt to chaos. When his internal conflict surfaced, the Empire had no structural answer. Emotional deviation was never modelled as a possibility. The Empire had built itself around singular figures rather than resilient systems. Palpatine was irreplaceable by design. Vader was indispensable by necessity. When either faltered, nothing existed to stabilize the structure. Endor revealed how little depth the Empire truly possessed. As the shield fell, the psychological impact rippled faster than physical destruction. Imperial crews were trained to expect dominance, not reversal. Once that expectation cracked, confidence evaporated. Ships did not merely lose firepower, they lost certainty. In war, certainty is often more decisive than weapons. The rebels, by contrast, had already accepted uncertainty as their natural state. They fought knowing defeat was possible, and survival was enough. Every small victory carried disproportionate weight because it confirmed adaptability. Endor rewarded this mindset relentlessly. Each improvised success compounded the next. The Empire's fleet began the battle believing itself invincible. It ended the battle believing itself surrounded by failure. That transition occurred with alarming speed. No doctrine existed to arrest the psychological freefall. Command paralysis replaced decisive action. Palpatine misinterpreted destiny as certainty rather than probability. His belief in the Force as a deterministic path blinded him to variance. He saw visions as guarantees instead of warnings. This philosophical error shaped every tactical mistake. Endor punished that misunderstanding mercilessly. By refusing to prepare for deviation, the Emperor ensured that deviation would be catastrophic. Contingency planning was seen as an admission of weakness. Yet true strength lies in surviving unexpected outcomes. The Empire mistook rigidity for power. Endor proved it was fragility. The notion that the rebels could meaningfully disrupt the plan was dismissed outright. Their desperation was mistaken for incompetence. Their diversity was mistaken for disorganization. In reality, these traits made them resilient. The Empire could not read an enemy that refused symmetry. Every Imperial asset at Endor depended on everything else functioning perfectly. The shield required the generator, the fleet required the shield, the Death Star required the fleet. No component could fail without endangering all others. This interdependence created a brittle architecture. One fracture was enough to collapse the whole. Fear had once unified the Empire through terror and spectacle. At Endor, spectacle became a liability. Too many eyes watched the Emperor's confidence unravel. Too many officers realized the myth was breaking. Fear cannot survive prolonged exposure to contradiction. What followed the opening collapse at Endor was not a sudden reversal, but an acceleration of forces already in motion. Once inevitability was broken, the Empire had nothing left to offer its own participants. Authority became performative rather than functional. Orders were issued because the structure required them, not because anyone believed they would succeed. The machinery kept moving, even as its purpose evaporated. The Emperor's greatest error was believing that destiny removed the need for preparation. In his mind, the future was a completed script rather than a dynamic process. This belief allowed him to ignore contingencies as distractions. He mistook foresight for control. Endor punished that confusion without mercy. Destiny, as Palpatine understood it, was rigid and hierarchical. It flowed downward from his will through Vader and into the Empire. Any disruption to that flow was unthinkable. Yet war thrives on disruption. The Emperor's refusal to accommodate deviation ensured that deviation would be fatal. When Vader turned, the effect was not merely emotional or symbolic. It ruptured the Empire's command logic at its core. Vader was both enforcer and executor, bridging will and action. His betrayal created an unfillable vacuum. There was no replacement because replacements were never allowed. The Empire had no contingency for internal fracture because loyalty was assumed, not earned. Betrayal existed only as a concept applied to enemies. The idea that the system itself could generate defection was dismissed. Endor revealed how brittle that assumption truly was. Once loyalty cracked at the top, it disintegrated everywhere else. Palpatine's death removed not just leadership but coherence. The Empire had been designed as an extension of his consciousness. Without it, subsystems competed rather than cooperated. Admirals acted without shared objectives. Local survival replaced unified strategy. Collapse became inevitable. The fleet's psychological defeat preceded its physical destruction. Crews watched the shield fail and understood the implications instantly. The Death Star was no longer an untouchable symbol, but a vulnerable target. Confidence drained away faster than hull integrity. Panic replaced discipline in subtle but decisive ways. Imperial doctrine offered no language for retreat under existential threat. Withdrawal implied weakness, and weakness was unacceptable. Ships remained engaged beyond rational thresholds. Losses mounted not because escape was impossible, but because it was unthinkable. Pride consumed resources faster than enemy fire. The rebels, conversely, were comfortable disengaging when necessary. They had survived by knowing when to vanish. Their objective was never total annihilation of the enemy. It was endurance. Endor rewarded this philosophy as imperial formations fractured under inflexibility. The difference in motivation between the two sides defined every exchange. The rebels fought for survival, identity, and future possibility. The Empire fought to maintain control it assumed already existed. One side needed to win to live. The other assumed winning was its natural state. This imbalance created asymmetrical stakes that the Empire never fully grasped. Rebels took risks because the alternative was extinction. Imperials avoided adaptation because the system discouraged deviation. Risk aversion in the face of chaos became a liability. Endor exploited it repeatedly. As the battle progressed, Imperial authority became increasingly hollow. Officers continued issuing commands that no longer aligned with reality. Subordinates followed them out of habit rather than belief. The chain of command existed structurally, but not psychologically. That distinction proved fatal. The Emperor's throne room confrontation mirrored the larger battle with unsettling clarity. Palpatine spoke in absolutes while reality shifted beneath him. Luke refused the role assigned to him. Vader rejected the function imposed upon him. Control evaporated the moment choice reasserted itself. This re-emergence of choice was the Empire's undoing. The system relied on the illusion that choice had already been eliminated. Endor demonstrated that choice could still disrupt even the most oppressive structure. That realization spread far beyond the battlefield. It infected the galaxy. Once the Death Star fell, the loss resonated less as a military disaster and more as a philosophical collapse. The Empire had promised permanence through fear. That promise was broken publicly and definitively. No amount of force could restore it. Legitimacy vanished with the wreckage. The notion that Endor ended the Empire oversimplifies the truth. The battle did not destroy Imperial capacity overnight. Fleets remained. Governors persisted. Systems stayed occupied. What Endor destroyed was credibility. Without credibility, power becomes unsustainable. The Empire was revealed as hollow because it had never cultivated resilience. It expanded outward while eroding inward. Loyalty was coerced rather than nurtured. Initiative was suppressed rather than encouraged. Endor exposed the consequences of that design philosophy. Fragility had been masked by spectacle for decades. Grand architecture, massive fleets, and rigid order created the illusion of strength. Yet beneath that surface lay dependence on a single will. Remove that will, and the structure collapses inward. Endor simply removed it. The rebels did not replace the Empire through force alone, they replaced its narrative. They demonstrated that dominance was neither natural nor permanent. Once that demonstration occurred, countless systems reassessed their allegiance. Fear could no longer outweigh possibility. In this sense, Endor functioned as a revelation rather than a conclusion. It showed what the Empire truly was when stripped of myth. A system incapable of adaptation cannot survive prolonged pressure. The pressure had been building for years. Endor merely applied it all at once. Every subsequent Imperial failure traces back to the same flaw exposed there: over-centralization, arrogance. contempt for deviation. These were not isolated mistakes, but systemic traits. Endor illuminated them with brutal clarity. The Emperor believed the future belonged to him because he could see fragments of it. He never considered that vision without flexibility is blindness. The Force showed possibilities, not certainties. By treating them as fixed, he locked himself into a single outcome. That outcome consumed him. What the galaxy learned at Endor was more important than who won the battle. It learned that the Empire was not inevitable. It learned that survival was possible. It learned that fear could be resisted. Knowledge replaced obedience, and obedience never recovered. This is why the battle endures as more than a victory. It is a case study in how arrogance corrodes power from within, how centralized control creates catastrophic single points of failure, how fear loses efficacy once challenged successfully. Endor revealed all of it at once. When the smoke cleared, the Empire was still present but no longer whole. Its authority was fragmented, contested, and doubted. The galaxy had seen behind the curtain. What remained was inertia, not dominance. History moved on without it. And in that movement, the lesson of Endor echoed forward. Power that cannot adapt will eventually face a moment it cannot control. Destiny mistaken for certainty invites collapse. The Empire learned this truth too late. The galaxy learned it just in time. Tonight.
Thank you for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that share button. My main channel is Critical Analysis Hub, where I post Star Wars content about the movies. My secondary channel is Critical Analysis Hub Plus, where I focus on the shows of Star Wars. And my third channel is Critical Analysis Hub XP, where I post comic books. Be sure to take a moment and check them out. Thanks, and may the Force be with you.